National Archives in Washington, D.C., houses millions of documents related to American history, but some files remain obscure until researchers stumble upon them and recognize their significance. On a morning in March 2024, historian Dr. Raymond Pierce is conducting research on Reconstruction-era land redistribution when he discovers a file that will lead him to uncover the story of one of the most remarkable figures of the Underground Railroad, a man who not only freed hundreds of enslaved people, but who, after the Civil War, used the legal system to acquire the plantations of his former enslavers and employed them as laborers on land they once owned, creating a complete reversal of power that terrified the white planter class across 3 southern states. The file contains a photograph, clearly from the early 20th century, based on the print quality, showing a black man in his late 20s, photographed from the shoulders, up against a softly blurred outdoor backdrop. He wears a simple, buttoned work shirt, his posture straight and composed. His expression is solemn but alert, lips closed, eyes slightly wide, as though he has just turned his attention toward the camera. His gaze is direct yet reserved, giving the sense of someone who is accustomed to being observed and scrutinized. The lighting highlights the smooth planes of his face and the texture of his short, natural hair. There's subtle speckling and edge damage on the image mimicking old glass plate photography. And cryptically, there's faint text reading 30-85%, stamped near the upper right corner. Raymond examines the photograph more closely. On the back, written in faded ink, is Silivan Jackson, taken 1905, age approximately 67, former conductor on the Underground Railroad, freed an estimated 400 enslaved people between 1855 and 1865. After the war, acquired 9 plantations through legal proceedings and employed former slaveholders as laborers. Photograph taken on land formerly owned by the Whitfield family of South Carolina, now owned by Jackson. The most feared name among former slaveholders in South Carolina, Georgia, and Virginia. And below that, in different handwriting, added much later, they called him the man who reversed the order. 9 men who once owned him worked his fields for wages. Justice or vengeance? History has never quite decided. Raymond reads the notation 3 times, his pulse quickening. He's spent decades researching Reconstruction and has never encountered Silivan Jackson's name. But if the notation is accurate, Jackson represents an extraordinary case. Someone who not only escaped slavery and helped hundreds of others escape, but who then used the legal mechanisms of Reconstruction to acquire the property of multiple former enslavers and reversed the power dynamic completely. Raymond spends the rest of that day searching through other archives. He finds scattered references to Silivan Jackson in Freedmen's Bureau records, testimony from congressional hearings on Reconstruction, property records from South Carolina, Georgia, and Virginia, and remarkably extensive testimony Jackson himself gave in 1866 describing his experiences. From the earliest document Raymond finds, a Freedmen's Bureau record from 1865, Silivan Jackson, formerly enslaved, has filed claims for compensation and land acquisition under the Confiscation Acts. Jackson states he was enslaved by 9 different owners between 1838 and 1855, during which time he was forced to participate in breeding practices designed to increase the enslaved population. Jackson escaped in 1855 and became a conductor on the Underground Railroad, operating primarily in Virginia, South Carolina, and Georgia. He estimates he personally freed approximately 400 enslaved people over 10 years. Jackson is now seeking legal acquisition of properties belonging to his former enslavers, many of whom are facing land confiscation due to their support of the Confederacy. Jackson's case is unprecedented in scope and has attracted significant attention. Raymond finds Jackson's own testimony, given to a congressional committee investigating conditions in the former Confederate states. The testimony is extensive, over 30 pages, and provides a detailed account of Jackson's life that is both harrowing and ultimately triumphant. From Silivan Jackson's testimony, delivered in Washington, D.C., February 1866. My name is Silivan Jackson. I was born enslaved in Virginia in 1838. I do not know the exact date of my birth, as enslaved people were not provided such information. I do not know my mother's name. She was sold away from the plantation where I was born when I was an infant, and I never saw her again. I was raised on a tobacco plantation in Virginia, owned by a man named Thomas Whitfield. When I was approximately 8 years old, Mr. Whitfield sold me to his brother Edward Whitfield, who owned a cotton plantation in South Carolina. Edward Whitfield had purchased several young enslaved children with the specific intention of raising us to be part of what he called his breeding program. I must explain to this committee what breeding meant in the context of slavery, though I know it is an uncomfortable subject. Beginning around 1808, when the international slave trade was abolished, slaveholders in the American South increasingly relied on natural increase, forcing enslaved people to reproduce, to maintain and grow their enslaved workforce. Some slaveholders implemented systematic breeding programs, selecting enslaved men and women they considered to have desirable traits and forcing them to produce children. Edward Whitfield was one such slaveholder. He selected me when I was approximately 16 years old to be what was called a breeding man. I was forced to father children with multiple enslaved women, whether I wished to or not, whether the women wished to or not. This was not romance, not love, not even voluntary. It was rape, systematized and enforced by slaveholders who viewed us as livestock to be bred. Between the ages of 16 and 29, I was forced to father approximately 30 children with different enslaved women. I knew these women only briefly, often just long enough for the forced encounter that Edward Whitfield demanded. I never had the opportunity to know my children, to raise them, to be a father to them in any meaningful way. Most were sold away before they reached adulthood. Some I never even saw after birth. This experience destroyed something fundamental in my humanity. I was being used as an instrument of reproduction, denied any say in the most intimate aspects of my existence, forced to participate in creating children who would be born into slavery and who I would likely never see grow up. The women who were forced to bear these children suffered even more: pregnancy, childbirth, the trauma of having children taken from them, all while being raped systematically in the name of increasing the enslaved population. I was sold 6 more times between 1854 and 1855. Each time I was sold, it was because of my reputation as a breeding man. Slaveholders knew I had fathered many children and believed I would continue to do so. I was sold to plantations in Georgia, Virginia, and South Carolina, forced to father more children with women I did not know and would never see again. In 1855, when I was approximately 17 years old, I was sold to a man named Robert Harrison in Virginia. Harrison owned a large plantation near the border with Maryland and was known for brutality even by the standards of slaveholders. It was on Harrison's plantation that I witnessed something that changed my life and set me on the path that would lead to my escape and my work on the Underground Railroad. There was a young woman on Harrison's plantation named Sarah. She was approximately 15 years old, just a girl. Harrison designated her to be bred, and he designated me to father her children. Sarah begged not to be forced into this. She was terrified. She was a child. She wanted no part of being used for breeding. I also protested, though I knew protest was dangerous. We were both severely beaten for our resistance. Harrison then forced the encounter, standing there to ensure we complied with his orders. Sarah cried throughout. I have carried the guilt and horror of that moment for my entire life, even though I know I was as much a victim as she was, even though I know the true evil was Harrison, who forced this to happen. Sarah became pregnant from that forced encounter. She was sick throughout the pregnancy, and Harrison showed her no mercy. She was still required to work in the fields until she went into labor. When the baby was born, it lived only 3 days before dying. Sarah was devastated. I was devastated. And Harrison was merely annoyed that his breeding program had failed to produce a viable child. After Sarah's baby died, I made the decision that I would escape or die trying. I could not continue to be used as an instrument of forced reproduction. I could not continue to participate, however involuntarily, in a system that treated human beings as livestock. In September 1855, I escaped from Harrison's plantation. I made my way north, using routes I had heard whispered about among enslaved people. The Underground Railroad, a network of people who helped fugitives reach freedom. I was aided by Quakers in Virginia, by free black people in Maryland, by abolitionists in Pennsylvania. By November 1855, I had reached Canada and was truly free for the first time in my life. But freedom was not enough. I could not rest knowing that hundreds of thousands of people remained enslaved, that the system of forced breeding continued, that women like Sarah were still being raped and forced to bear children who would be enslaved. I decided I would dedicate my life to helping others escape. I returned to the United States in early 1856, a dangerous decision, as I was a fugitive who could be recaptured and returned to slavery at any time. But I was determined to become what was called a conductor on the Underground Railroad, someone who personally guided enslaved people from the South to freedom in the North or Canada. For the next 10 years, from 1856 until 1865, when the war ended, I worked as a conductor. I made approximately 40 trips into the South, into Virginia, South Carolina, and Georgia, and I personally guided approximately 400 enslaved people to freedom. I targeted plantations where I knew breeding programs were operating, prioritizing helping women and children escape, especially those who were being forced to reproduce. This work was extraordinarily dangerous. If I had been caught, I would have been killed. There was no question about that. Helping enslaved people escape was considered one of the worst crimes in the South, and I was helping dozens at a time. But I was driven by the memory of Sarah, of the 30-some children I had been forced to father and would never know, of all the people still suffering under the system I had escaped. I became known in Underground Railroad circles as someone who specialized in extracting people from the worst situations, from breeding plantations, from the most brutal slaveholders. I kept meticulous records of the plantations I visited, the people I helped escape, and the slaveholders who were operating breeding programs. I documented everything because I believed, I hoped, that someday slavery would end and there would be accountability. During these 10 years, I learned about the operations of 9 plantations in particular. Plantations where I had been enslaved or where I had conducted rescue operations. I knew the layout of these plantations, knew the slaveholders personally, knew the exact nature of the crimes they had committed. These 9 men, Thomas Whitfield, Edward Whitfield, Robert Harrison, Samuel Patterson, William Thornton, James Beaufort, Henry Caldwell, George Morrison, and Richard Stevens, had owned me at various times, or had been targets of my Underground Railroad operations. When the war began in 1861, I continued my Underground Railroad work. When Union forces began advancing into the South, I offered my services as a scout and guide, using my knowledge of Southern terrain to help Union troops. When the war ended in 1865, I immediately filed claims under the Confiscation Acts, seeking to acquire land that had been confiscated from Confederate supporters. The Confiscation Acts, passed by Congress during the war, authorized the seizure of property from people who had supported the Confederacy. Some of this confiscated land was supposed to be redistributed to formerly enslaved people as compensation for years of unpaid labor. This redistribution was inconsistent, and most formerly enslaved people never received land. But I was determined to pursue every legal avenue available. I filed claims for 9 specific plantations, the properties owned by the 9 men who had enslaved me or operated the breeding programs I had infiltrated. I had extensive documentation, records of my enslavement on these plantations, testimony from people I had freed who could verify the breeding programs, my own meticulous notes from 10 years of Underground Railroad operations. The legal process took months and faced fierce opposition from white Southerners who were horrified at the idea of a formerly enslaved black man acquiring major plantations. But I had excellent lawyers, abolitionists and radical Republicans, who saw my case as a test of whether Reconstruction would deliver actual justice or merely end legal slavery while preserving the old racial order. Between 1866 and 1868, through legal proceedings, I acquired all 9 plantations. The properties were granted to me as compensation for years of unpaid labor and in recognition of my service to the Union during the war. The total land acquisition was approximately 8,000 acres across South Carolina, Georgia, and Virginia, with a combined value of over $400,000. But land acquisition was only the beginning of what I intended. I wanted to reverse the power dynamic completely, to create a situation where the men who had once owned me and used me for breeding would experience what it meant to work under someone else's authority, to labor for wages, to understand that their livelihoods depended on the goodwill of someone they had once considered property. Of the 9 men whose plantations I acquired, 7 were still alive in 1866. 2, Thomas Whitfield and Samuel Patterson, had died during the war, but Robert Harrison, Edward Whitfield, William Thornton, James Beaufort, Henry Caldwell, George Morrison, and Richard Stevens were all alive, and all had been left essentially impoverished by the war and by the confiscation of their land. I made each of them an offer. I would employ them as laborers on the land that used to be theirs. I would pay them fair wages, the same wages I paid formerly enslaved people who worked on my properties. They would work under my authority, follow my directions, and be subject to the same rules as every other worker. The alternative was that they would have no employment at all and would face destitution. So, one by one, all 7 agreed. By 1868, All 7 of my surviving former enslavers were working as paid laborers on land they once owned, taking orders from me, the man they had once enslaved and used for breeding. I want to be clear to this committee. I did not abuse these men. I did not beat them, did not starve them, did not treat them with the cruelty they had shown me and others. I paid fair wages, provided decent working conditions, treated them with the dignity that every worker deserves. But I also made clear that they would work, that they would labor in the fields they once forced others to labor in, that they would understand what it meant to depend on someone else for their survival. The reversal was complete. The men who once owned me now worked for me. The men who once forced me to breed for their profit now picked cotton and cut tobacco for my profit. The men who considered themselves masters of a racial hierarchy now took orders from someone they had once considered subhuman property. This arrangement terrified white Southerners across the region. I became known as the man who reversed the order, and my name was spoken with hatred and fear by former slaveholders who saw my success as a threat to their belief in white supremacy. If a formerly enslaved black man could acquire major plantations and employ his former enslavers, what did that say about the racial hierarchy they insisted was natural and permanent? I received death threats regularly. I survived 3 assassination attempts between 1868 and 1872. My properties were targeted by arsonists and night riders, but I refused to be intimidated. I hired guards, many of them formerly enslaved people, who I had helped free through the Underground Railroad, and we protected the land and the operations I had built. I continued to employ my former enslavers until they could find other work, or until they died. Robert Harrison worked on what used to be his plantation until he died in 1873. Edward Whitfield worked until 1875, when his health failed. The others gradually found other employment or left the region entirely, unable to bear the humiliation of working for someone they had once enslaved. By 1880, I directly employed over 300 people on my various properties, all formerly enslaved people or their children, all receiving fair wages and decent treatment. I built schools on my properties so that workers' children could receive education. I established churches where communities could worship freely. I created the kind of system I had dreamed of during my years in slavery. A system where black people controlled their own labor, received compensation for their work, and lived with dignity. Now, in 1886, I am approximately 68 years old. I have spent the last 20 years proving that formerly enslaved people are fully capable of managing large agricultural operations, of being successful business owners, of building communities based on fairness rather than exploitation. My story is unusual. I know that. Most formerly enslaved people did not acquire plantations, did not employ their former enslavers, did not reverse the power dynamic as completely as I did. But my story proves what is possible when formerly enslaved people are given access to land, capital, and legal protection. It proves that the old racial hierarchy was based on power and violence, not on any natural order. I file this testimony to document what was done to me and what I did in response. I was forced to participate in breeding programs that treated human beings as livestock. I escaped and dedicated a decade to freeing others from that same system. When slavery ended, I used legal means to acquire the property of those who had enslaved me, and I employed them as laborers to demonstrate that the power dynamic could be reversed completely. I do not know what judgment history will make of my actions, Some say I achieved justice. Others say I took revenge. I say I proved that formerly enslaved people deserve compensation, deserve land, deserve the opportunity to reverse the power dynamics that kept us in bondage for so long. And I proved that white Southerners' claims of natural racial hierarchy were lies. When the legal system changed, the power changed, and the racial order could be completely reversed. Raymond finishes reading the testimony with his hands shaking. Silivan Jackson's story is extraordinary. Not just his work on the Underground Railroad, but his systematic legal acquisition of 9 plantations and his employment of 7 former slaveholders as laborers. This represents one of the most complete reversals of power from the Reconstruction era that Raymond has ever encountered. He contacts Dr. Helen Washington, a historian at the University of South Carolina, who specializes in Reconstruction land redistribution and the brief period when formerly enslaved people had some ability to acquire property from their former enslavers. Helen has spent decades documenting cases of black land ownership during Reconstruction and the violent backlash that eventually stripped most of that land away. Helen calls him back within an hour. Silivan Jackson. The name is vaguely familiar from my research on Reconstruction-era property transfers in South Carolina. If you found his complete testimony and documentation of his land acquisitions, this is groundbreaking. Send me everything immediately. Raymond scans all the materials and emails them to Helen. They arrange to meet at the South Carolina Department of Archives and History in Columbia, where Helen has already requested property records, court documents, and newspaper archives from 1865, 1890. Over the following days, Raymond and Helen piece together the complete story of what Silivan Jackson accomplished and what eventually happened to his land empire. They find property records documenting his acquisition of all 9 plantations between 1866 1868. They find court records showing the fierce legal battles white Southerners waged, trying to strip him of the land. They find newspaper accounts from Southern papers expressing outrage that a formerly enslaved person owned major plantations. From the Charleston Mercury, a virulently pro-Confederate newspaper, 1868. The outrageous case of Silivan Jackson. The Negro calling himself Silivan Jackson has acquired through legal chicanery and northern interference 9 plantations in South Carolina, Georgia, and Virginia, properties that rightfully belong to white families who have owned these lands for generations. Jackson, who claims to be a former slave, is now employing white men as laborers on land they once owned. This reversal of the natural order is an abomination that threatens the very foundation of Southern civilization. Jackson has become a symbol of Negro arrogance and Northern tyranny. Decent people throughout the South pray for the day when this injustice will be corrected and proper order restored. But they also find accounts in Northern newspapers celebrating Jackson's success. From the National Anti-Slavery Standard, 1868. The remarkable case of Mr. Silivan Jackson. Mr. Jackson, who was enslaved for 29 years and forced to participate in the barbaric breeding practices that characterized the worst of Southern slavery, has become one of the most successful landowners in the South. Through legal means, using the Confiscation Acts and compensation for his service to the Union, Mr. Jackson has acquired 9 substantial plantations. Most remarkably, he has employed 7 of his former enslavers as paid laborers, demonstrating that the power dynamics of slavery can be completely reversed when the legal system changes. Mr. Jackson's success proves that formerly enslaved people are fully capable of managing complex agricultural operations, and that with access to land and capital, they can thrive and build prosperous communities. Raymond and Helen find extensive documentation of the threats and violence Jackson faced. From Freedmen's Bureau reports, Mr. Silivan Jackson has reported multiple attempts on his life. In March 1869, armed men believed to be members of the Ku Klux Klan attacked his property in South Carolina, burning several outbuildings and attempting to reach the main house where Jackson resided. Jackson and his employees, many of whom are armed and trained, repelled the attack. 3 assailants were captured and turned over to authorities, though it is unclear if they will face prosecution given the current climate. Jackson has requested additional federal protection, noting that his success in reversing the traditional power structure makes him a target for white supremacist violence. They discover that Jackson maintained his properties and operations for over 20 years. Property records show he owned the 9 plantations until the early 1890s, when the backlash against Reconstruction intensified and legal mechanisms were increasingly used to strip black landowners of their properties. From property records in 1892, Silivan Jackson, under legal pressure and following changes to property tax assessments that made maintaining his holdings financially impossible, has sold 6 of his 9 properties to white buyers. Jackson retains 3 properties in South Carolina, totaling approximately 2,000 acres. The sale represents a significant reduction in Jackson's land holdings and is part of a broader pattern of black landowners being forced to sell or having property seized through legal mechanisms during the post-Reconstruction period. By 1895, Jackson had been forced to sell all but 1 of his properties. He retained a single plantation of approximately 500 acres in South Carolina, where he lived until his death. They find Jackson's obituary from 1912, published in a black newspaper in Charleston. Mr. Silivan Jackson, hero of the Underground Railroad, dies at 74. Mr. Silivan Jackson, who passed away Tuesday at his home near Charleston, was one of the most remarkable figures of the Civil War and Reconstruction eras. Born into slavery, forced to participate in breeding programs that represented the worst cruelties of that system, Mr. Jackson escaped in 1855 and became one of the most successful conductors on the Underground Railroad, personally freeing an estimated 400 enslaved people. After the war, Mr. Jackson used legal means to acquire 9 plantations belonging to men who had enslaved him, and he employed 7 of his former enslavers as paid laborers, creating a reversal of power that shocked and terrified white Southerners. For over 20 years, Mr. Jackson operated successful agricultural operations and built communities where formerly enslaved people could live and work with dignity. In later years, as Reconstruction ended and legal mechanisms were used to strip black landowners of their properties, Mr. Jackson was forced to sell most of his holdings. But he never regretted his actions or his determination to prove that formerly enslaved people deserved land, compensation, and the opportunity to reverse the power dynamics that had oppressed them. Mr. Jackson is survived by numerous descendants, many of whom never met him as they were children. He was forced to father during slavery and was separated from. His legacy is not just the land he briefly owned or the formerly enslaved people he freed, but the proof he provided that the racial order of slavery was based on power and violence, not nature, and that when legal systems changed, that order could be completely reversed. He will be remembered as a man who dedicated his life to justice and who fearlessly challenged the white supremacy that had enslaved him. Over the following months, Raymond and Helen worked to create an exhibition documenting Silivan Jackson's extraordinary life. They tracked down descendants, a difficult process since Jackson had fathered approximately 30 children through forced breeding, but had been separated from almost all of them. They find some descendants who carry family stories about Jackson, though many didn't know the full scope of his achievements. 15 months after Raymond first discovered that file, the National Archives opens the exhibition, Reversing the Order, Silivan Jackson and the Fight for Justice After Slavery. The exhibition occupies a major gallery designed to honor Jackson, while honestly examining both the horrors he experienced and the remarkable achievements of his later life. The centerpiece is the 1905 photograph, Jackson at age 67, his direct gaze meeting the camera with dignity and determination. A detailed explanation accompanies the image. Silivan Jackson was photographed in 1905 on land in South Carolina that he had acquired in 1866 from his former enslaver, Edward Whitfield. Between 1866 to 1868, Jackson legally acquired 9 plantations belonging to men who had enslaved him or operated breeding programs he had infiltrated during his work on the Underground Railroad. For over 20 years, he employed 7 of his former enslavers as paid laborers, creating a complete reversal of the power dynamic that had existed under slavery. Jackson's success terrified white Southerners and made him a target for violence. But he persisted in proving that formerly enslaved people deserved land, compensation, and justice. The exhibition tells Jackson's complete story through his own testimony, legal documents, property records, newspaper accounts, and historical context. It doesn't shy away from the brutal reality of forced breeding, displaying Jackson's testimony about being used as a breeding man and forced to father children he would never know, showing how slavery treated human reproduction as a method of creating more enslaved people to increase slaveholders' wealth. One section focuses on Jackson's decade as an Underground Railroad conductor, documenting his 40 trips into the South and the approximately 400 people he helped free. Maps show the routes he used. Testimony from people he freed describes their experiences, and records show how Jackson specialized in extracting people from breeding plantations. Another section examines Jackson's systematic legal acquisition of 9 plantations between 1866 and 1868, showing how he used the Confiscation Acts, his documentation of crimes committed by slaveholders, and his service to the Union to build legal cases for land acquisition. Property records, court documents, and legal arguments are all displayed, demonstrating that Jackson's acquisitions were entirely legal and based on sound legal principles. The exhibition includes extensive documentation of how Jackson employed his former enslavers. Letters, employment records, and testimony show that Jackson treated these men fairly, paying decent wages, providing reasonable working conditions, but requiring them to work under his authority and to understand what it meant to labor for someone else's profit. The exhibition acknowledges the symbolic power of this reversal, while also noting that Jackson was not cruel or abusive, that he created fair working conditions rather than replicating the brutality of slavery. A section on backlash documents the death threats, assassination attempts, and arson attacks Jackson faced from white supremacist groups that saw his success as a threat to racial hierarchy. Freedmen's Bureau reports, newspaper accounts, and court records show the violence directed at Jackson and how he organized armed defense of his properties. The exhibition also honestly examines what happened as Reconstruction ended, how legal mechanisms including discriminatory tax assessments, harassment through the court system, and violence were used to force black landowners like Jackson to sell their properties. Property records show Jackson being forced to sell 6 plantations in 1892, then gradually losing all but 1 property by 1895, and finally dying in 1912, with only a small fraction of the land empire he had built. A video plays continuously featuring historians discussing forced breeding under slavery, the Underground Railroad, Reconstruction land redistribution, and the violent backlash that stripped most formerly enslaved people of land they had acquired. Descendants of people Jackson freed share family stories about how Jackson changed their ancestors' lives. On opening day, Raymond stands in the gallery watching visitors engage with the exhibition. He sees people study Jackson's photograph, understanding the extraordinary life story behind that direct, dignified gaze. Helen stands beside him, looking at the image. Silivan Jackson was 67 in this photograph, she says quietly. He'd been forced to father 30 children through breeding programs, had escaped and freed 400 others, had acquired 9 plantations through legal means, had employed his former enslavers for over 20 years, and had watched as almost everything he built was stripped away during the post-Reconstruction backlash. But look at his face. There's no defeat there, no regret. There's dignity and determination. He proved what he set out to prove, that the racial order of slavery was based on power, not nature, and that when the law changed, that order could be completely reversed. Even though most of his land was eventually taken, he proved it was possible. A young black man who identifies himself as one of Jackson's descendants approaches them. "My great-great-grandfather was one of the children Jackson was forced to father," he says. "Jackson never knew him. They were separated when my great-great-grandfather was sold as a child. But the family story was always that we were descended from a man who had been a hero of the Underground Railroad, and who later owned plantations where his former masters worked for him. I never fully believed the story until now. Seeing the documentation, understanding what Silivan Jackson accomplished, it's extraordinary. He turned his trauma into action, his oppression into liberation for hundreds of others, his powerlessness into complete reversal of the power dynamic. That's an incredible legacy." An elderly white woman stops to read Jackson's testimony about forced breeding for a long time. "This is one of the most brutal aspects of slavery," she says, tears streaming down her face. "Treating human beings as livestock to be bred, forcing people to reproduce against their will, separating parents from children. And then Silivan Jackson escaped, freed 400 others, and made his former enslavers work his land. That's justice. I understand why white Southerners were terrified. He proved their entire racial hierarchy was a lie." Throughout the day, visitors engaged deeply with the exhibition, understanding that Jackson's story represents both the worst brutality of slavery and the extraordinary achievements possible when formerly enslaved people had access to legal protection and opportunities during Reconstruction. The photograph that shows a composed, dignified older man reveals itself to be a portrait of someone who experienced unimaginable trauma and responded with a decade of heroic rescue work, and then over 20 years of proving that power dynamics could be completely reversed. As the museum prepares to close that evening, Raymond walks through the gallery one more time. He stops in front of Jackson's photograph, looking at that direct, steady gaze. He thinks about Silivan Jackson, forced to father 30 children he would never know, forced to participate in breeding programs that treated humans as livestock, escaping at age 29 and dedicating the next decade to freeing 400 others, then using legal means to acquire 9 plantations and employ 7 former enslavers as laborers, maintaining that reversed power dynamic for over 20 years before finally losing most of his land in the post-Reconstruction backlash. He thinks about the 9 men who once enslaved Jackson and who then worked for him, picking cotton, cutting tobacco, taking orders from someone they had once considered property. What must that have been like for them? Did they understand the justice in it, or only feel humiliation? Did working under fair conditions for fair wages teach them anything about the humanity of the people they had enslaved? And he thinks about the 400 people Jackson freed, people who escaped slavery because Jackson risked his life again and again to guide them to freedom, people whose descendants are alive today, because Jackson refused to accept his own freedom as enough. The photograph waited 119 years to tell Silivan Jackson's full story. The image that shows a composed older man on land he legally acquired has become testimony to resistance, justice, and the brief moment during Reconstruction when formerly enslaved people could use legal means to acquire property from their oppressors and reverse the power dynamic completely. Now the photograph has fulfilled a purpose Jackson surely intended when he agreed to be photographed on land that used to belong to Edward Whitfield. His story has been told. His achievements have been documented. His proof that the racial order could be reversed has been preserved. And future generations can understand that justice was possible, even if it was temporary and incomplete. As visitors file past the image one last time, many stopping to look at Jackson's eyes and see the strength and determination behind that steady gaze. Raymond thinks about all the other formerly enslaved people who acquired land during Reconstruction, only to have it stripped away. All the other stories of resistance and temporary victory that deserve to be told. All the other proof that when legal systems change, power dynamics can be reversed completely. Silivan Jackson, born enslaved 1838, forced into breeding programs, forced to father 30 children, escaped 1855, became an Underground Railroad conductor, 1856, 1865, freed approximately 400 people, legally acquired 9 plantations, 1866, 1868, employed 7 former enslavers as laborers, maintained operations for over 20 years, lost most of his land in the 1890s, died 1912, having proved what he set out to prove, that formerly enslaved people deserved land and compensation, that power dynamics could be reversed, and that the racial hierarchy of slavery was based on violence and law, not nature or inevitability. His story has been told. His legacy has been honored. And Raymond is grateful to have played a part in ensuring that Silivan Jackson is remembered as one of the most remarkable figures of the Underground Railroad and Reconstruction. A man who experienced the worst of slavery and responded with courage, determination, and an unwavering commitment to justice that terrified his former oppressors and proved that everything they believed about racial hierarchy was a lie.